Here we go with the final installment for Chapter 3. When I say final installment, what I mean is Part 3. The focus of Part 3, perception. Perception is defined as the process with which individuals detect and interpret environmental stimuli. Basically, as we use our five senses, how do we gather information from outside of us? Not just gather it, but how do we make sense of it? That's what we mean by interpret. How do we make sense of it? As it says here, perception is not entirely rational. In other words, what we see is a function of what we value, our needs, our fears, our emotions, our previous experiences. All of that, a word you might use is colors what we see. We imagine that we are objectively detecting environmental stimuli. We ain't. There's no such thing as objectively detecting environmental stimuli, not when we're talking about people. Instead, everything is filtered. Filtered, again, through our values, our needs, our fears, our emotions, our prior experiences, even just what we expect to see. That all conditions what we in fact see. If you take the case of visual perception, we know for a fact that our visual perception goes beyond the information that is physically available. For example, you look at this figure, and we all see a white triangle, even though there isn't one there. Instead, we've just got these like Pac-Man figures, right? The circles with the triangles taken out of them. But because of the way they're aligned, we imagine, we perceive that there's this white triangle, but it's not really there. Continuing with the idea of visual perception, this is a classic test. You put this in front of people and you say, which inner circle is bigger? This one or this one? This one or this one? Well, of course, the right answer is neither. They're exactly the same. Why does the one on the left look bigger then? Well, the reason it does is because the circles around it are smaller. Whereas in the other figure, the circles around the center circle are larger. And the contrast effect influences how we perceive those inner circles. The one is contrasted with smaller circles. The other is contrasted with bigger circles. And so we imagine that the one is bigger than the other, when in fact they are the exact same size. Something as simple as this should illustrate, I hope it illustrates for you, the reality that our perception is not necessarily about being objective, but rather is influenced by other factors. Let's talk about our self-perception. One way that we can talk about this is through the lens of self-enhancement bias. This is our tendency to overestimate our own performance and capabilities, basically to see ourselves positively, to imagine that we're the friendliest, the most generous, the smartest, the fastest, the coolest, the you name it, whatever it is ending in EST. We tend to think we're pretty great. We do well in a given class and we think, oh, I'm good at that always. Or we get good feedback on our writing in one situation and we imagine, yeah, we're really a great writer. Well, maybe, but, maybe not. Maybe we're not quite as great as we think we are. On the other hand, self-effacement bias is the tendency to underestimate our own performance and capabilities, to see ourselves in a negative light. So again, not objectively perceiving ourselves, but maybe thinking, I'm not really that good at this. I'm not smart enough to do this. I'm not popular enough to do that. I'm not athletic enough for this. I'm not fill in the blank. I'm not something enough to do something else. False consensus error happens when we overestimate how similar they are or we are to other people. So we imagine, for example, that everyone who's around our age thinks the same way that we do, or everyone who came from our high school thinks a certain way, or everyone raised, let's say, in a particular faith tradition thinks or behaves a certain way, or everyone who shares the same gender identification as we do maybe thinks the same way. And we don't bother actually collecting data on what any of these people actually thinks or what they actually do. We make assumptions that there's a consensus, that there's an agreement among all the people who fit a particular demographic, if you will. I'll bet you can think of examples for each of these. One where you've sort of overestimated how well you might do on something, and then, whoopsies, discovered perhaps after the fact that, yeah, you actually weren't that great at it, at least in that particular circumstance. Or with self-effacement, where you've thought, yeah, you're not so good, and you were surprised to discover that, yeah, I actually I'm pretty good. I'm better at this than I thought I would be. And then false consensus, where you thought you had a lot in common with some other people, perhaps because of some demographic characteristic that you share, only to discover that, guess what? Yeah, y'all aren't in agreement about whatever that thing might be. Social perception is what we really care about a lot in organizational behavior. And the reason this is true is that how we perceive things, what we perceive, is in fact what drives our behavior. So, not the objective reality, but rather what we perceive, that dictates or conditions our actions. So, we gather, if you look at the figure, we gather information from the environment. We filter that information through our values, our emotions, our feelings, our personality, our prior experiences, our expectations. All of that adds up to our perceptions, which in turn drive our actions. Again, let me make this critical point. What we perceive is what drives our actions. It's not as simple as we take in information from the environment objectively and that drives our actions. No. Instead, it's all filtered. And what we perceive, what we think is true, what we assume to be true, that's what actually drives our behavior. I need you to keep this in mind as we talk about, for example, why leaders do what they do, why they treat their employees, their direct reports, their subordinates. Those are all terms that we use for employees. Why they treat those people the way they do has everything to do with their perceptions. I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase selective perception, basically where we only pay attention to certain parts. For example, maybe we only pay attention to news that aligns with what we already believe to be true. Or when we're listening to a professor talk, we only pay attention when perhaps the person uses an example that relates to something we've personally experienced. And the rest just sort of slips past us and dissipates into the ether. Selective perception, again, only paying attention to certain things in our environment, and that has a lot to do with our values, our emotions, feelings, personality, etc. Major topic we want to talk about, again, related to what I was just describing, is this notion of attributions. Attributions are defined as the causal explanations that we give for observed behavior. So you and I observe people doing different things, and in our minds, we create what we call a tacit theory a tacit, T-A-C-I-T, theory to explain what we're observing. Example, imagine you're sitting in a regular classroom and someone comes in late to class. You observe that person coming in late to class. In your mind, you have a tacit theory for what's going on, why that person is late to class. Sometimes our tacit theories are internal attributions, meaning that we explain the person's behavior by considering their characteristics. Basically, we blame the person. Whereas with external attributions, we assign blame or responsibility to the situation instead of to the person. So internal to the person, external, outside the person. Self-serving bias is our tendency to attribute our failures to the situation. So when things don't go so hot for me, that's not my fault. That's the stupid technology, or that's the stupid whatever. It's not me. Whereas when things go well, that's about our own preparation, that's about our own experiences. It's the stuff that we had some control over. Then we go, yeah, that was me. That was me. So basically, no matter what, we're only going to be thinking positive thoughts about ourselves, because the bad things that happen, well, those are not our fault. Those are the fault of other people or the situation. So let's talk a little bit more about these attributions. There are 3 factors that influence ultimately whether we decide that a person's behavior should be attributed to them, that's the internal, or to the situation, that's external. And the 3 factors are consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency. So consensus, the key question that we're asking ourselves in our heads when we observe someone behaving a certain way is, do other people behave the same way? In other words, is there agreement? That's what consensus means. Is there agreement around the right way to behave? Distinctiveness is, does the person behave the same way in different situations? Or is their behavior distinctive, unique to a particular situation? And then finally, consistency. Does the person behave this way in different occasions in the same situation? So are they consistent? Are they reliable with respect to their behavior? All right, so let's take these 3. Let's use an example. We're going to start on the lower row, where we're going to end up making an internal attribution. So again, imagine the person who is late to class. And I'm going to work right to left. So the person is late to class, and you know what we've noticed? There's a lot of consistency, meaning every single time this person is in this situation. Imagine a class that starts at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, Thursday, in what would have been the South Teaching Wing, room 105, where we were supposed to be. Okay. Every time, every single class day, every Tuesday and Thursday, the person is 10 minutes late. Let's call this person, let's call them Joe. Joe is late by like 10 minutes every single class day. When we consider distinctiveness, you've got Joe in more than one class, let's say. Not just the Tuesday, Thursday at 10, but maybe also the Tuesday, Thursday at noon. And what you've observed is Joe is late to both classes. Both classes. So always late to the 10 o'clock and also usually late to the 12 o'clock. So not distinctive. Being late to the 10 o'clock is not distinctive. Not at all. It's low distinctiveness. And then finally, like nobody else is late. Just Joe. So it's only Joe who's late to the 10 o'clock class. Well, based upon your observation and your determination of high consistency, low distinctiveness, and low consensus, you're going to assign the blame, or you're going to attribute Joe's behavior to Joe. It's an internal thing. Joe just doesn't know how to manage their time. Joe just doesn't know how to set a clock. Joe doesn't pay attention. Something. It's on Joe. That's the bottom line. Now let's imagine a different situation where you notice that Joe is late, let's say on March 26th, which would be Thursday. Joe came in late that day to class, but every other class day, Joe's on time. So low consistency. It was just that Thursday. Again, you've got Joe in more than one class, and Joe is like never late for the other class, ever, always on time. So high distinctiveness. It's just that one time. Again, it's unique to this particular situation, that particular class, that particular time. The other thing you notice is it isn't just Joe rolling in late. There was like 5 or 6 people who rolled in late to that 10 o'clock class on that particular day. What tacit theory might we use to explain this behavior? And trust me, we are all thinking stuff. We are all thinking about explanations. Most likely our explanation in this case is going to be external. In other words, we're going to say something like, well, maybe another class got out late, or maybe these folks all live in the same dorm and there was some issue in the dorm that kept them from getting out on time and to their class on time. No matter what, you're not going to attribute things to them individually or personally, not internally. The attribution you make will be external. Hopefully, these 2 examples clarify what we mean when we say we're making an internal attribution versus an external attribution. And that's it. You made it all the way through Chapter 3. Thanks for hanging in there, and we'll see you for the next chapter.